A little more than 3 months ago, the Senate Republicans came together and reached something of a conclusion. We concluded it made a lot of sense to make a commitment to each other and a commitment to those we represent and a commitment to those in the other chamber just down the hall from here, that we wouldn't be sending another penny to Ukraine without achieving border security in our own homeland. After all, the conflict in Ukraine is about helping Ukraine maintain its own defensible borders. It's about helping Ukraine with its own national security. Meanwhile, we've got a border that's, to describe it as porous is an insult to porousness. It is a border through which an estimated 10 million people have entered our country unlawfully just over the last 3 years since President Biden took office. And then now, through the efforts of a faithless few, we were poised to treat our promise to Americans the same way President Biden has treated his solemn oath to protect our country's borders, as somehow expedient, expendable, and apparently now expired. Madam President, we cannot send billions of dollars to Ukraine, many tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine, while America's own borders are bleeding, while they're wide open, and while we've got many thousands upon thousands of the 10 million or so who have come in over the last 3 years, who are coming in under circumstances that make them highly suspicious, to say nothing of the millions of others who came in. But just in the last few months alone, we know that thousands have come in from countries that are not in Latin America, from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, China, and a lot of other countries where we have a lot of people who don't like this country, who don't share its values, who don't share its vision, don't share its commitment to the rule of law, and who have come in here. We know nothing about them. They come in unvetted, in some cases unseen, but in some respects, it's even more troubling. The ones who come in that our government knows about, they are processed and then released. Processed, meaning we take down a bunch of information about them, then release them into the country, either under the pretense that they have applied for asylum and might be deemed qualified to receive that form of relief, or alternatively, under the theory that they can be brought in under what's known as immigration parole, a category that's never supposed to be used. In fact, by law, it can't be used categorically to treat all people from a certain country a certain way. No, it's there to be used in unusual circumstances, either for humanitarian compassionate need, like, somebody's loved one has passed away and they need to attend a funeral, or they need to come to attend to a critically ill loved one, or alternatively, a public use exception under immigration parole, such as somebody speaks a foreign language that's badly needed, where they need an interpreter. Very few people speak that in this country, and they've found one from somebody outside the United States. This is a way of getting them into the country for a short period of time. So sometimes they're brought in under the asylum theory, others under the parole theory. Others still are brought in under withheld removal, are just told you don't have to leave now. In many of these circumstances, the people who are released into the interior of the country are told at some point you will have a hearing before an immigration judge. We hope you will come to that. And by the way, your immigration hearing before the immigration judge may well be in the 2030s, may well be in 2035 or later. But in the meantime, have fun. We'll get you a plane ticket to the U.S. city of your choice. And by the way, those pesky things that American citizens have to worry about when traveling from one part of the United States to another, like airplane tickets, we've taken care of that. Also, identification papers. Americans have to produce a photo ID establishing who they are at an airport. You don't have to worry about that either. We'll fly you anywhere you want. Have fun. Well, it's not long before international drug cartels pick up on the fact that this is a great source of revenue for them. It's a great source of revenue and also a great source of facilitating their other businesses when they can traffic human beings in large numbers. You see, these drug cartels are making many tens of billions of dollars every single year smuggling in human traffic into the interior of the United States. And why wouldn't they? People want the American dream. People like the opportunity to live here. Maybe for some, it's perceived as a great way to earn more money that can be sent back home. Maybe some want to live here permanently and make it their home. Maybe others want to inflict harm on the United States. We don't really know because we've thrown caution to the wind. We've just, under the failed leadership of President Joe Biden, we've just brought them in by the millions. It's been a really good deal for the drug cartels, who have made tens of billions of dollars a year as a result of this criminally negligent approach toward enforcing the border. Now, their approach to enforcing the border in these respects is non-enforcement. It's deliberate, willful non-enforcement, inuring to the great detriment, to the great harm, and presenting incredibly indefensible risks to the American people. This has gone on now for over 3 years. It kicked in, as I remember, right as President Biden took office. He started issuing executive orders, undoing things like the Remain in Mexico program, the migrant protection protocols, the safe third country agreements carefully negotiated by the previous administration, which also had some migrant surges and surges of illegal immigration. But to its credit, the previous administration did something about it by putting in place these programs to guarantee that if someone coming into the United States without documentation across our southern border by land thereafter claimed asylum, for example, they would have to wait in Mexico, remain in Mexico, while his or her asylum application remained pending. Why does that matter? Well, statistics tell us that for every person who applies for asylum, every 10 people who apply for asylum, rather, fewer than one will actually receive it. Some say it's around 90%, others will say it's in the high 90s. The percentages of people who apply for asylum who are deemed ineligible for asylum. They're not eligible to receive it. And yet we receive all these people in here. So anyway, President Biden takes office. About that time, somebody asked Secretary Mayorkas, either just before or just after he was confirmed by the Senate, I don't remember which. They asked him a question. What would you say to people who were part of these migrant caravans that were by then traveling through southern Mexico, making their way toward the United States? What would you say to them? Now, the kind of answer you would hope and expect that we should be able to demand that we would receive from the chief immigration law enforcement officer in the United States should have been, don't come. Don't come. Why? Well, because the risks are myriad. You don't want to enter this country with your first step into the country being an act in violation of our law. You don't want to subject yourself or your family members who may be with you to great risk to life and limb. You don't want to subject anyone, but especially women and girls traveling with those caravans, to the risk of sexual assault. The statistics vary on this wildly. At the low end, some say that the number is around 30% of the women and girls who were sexually assaulted in the journey. Others say it's much more likely to be in the mid-60% range of women and girls sexually assaulted along these horrible, dangerous journeys. And of course, women and girls are not the only victims of sexual assault along the way. Men and boys also have that happen to them. What's even worse, a number of these individuals, disproportionately women and girls more than men and boys, but I believe there are some in each category, end up being subjected to a form of sex slavery. You see, it costs many thousands of dollars to be trafficked into this country by a drug cartel. Many thousands of dollars. The higher the risk you are, the more distant the country you come from, especially if it's separated by an ocean from the Americas, the more likely you are to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars. If you're from Latin America, some are able to make the payment with a few $1,000s, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 maybe. Others pay a little bit more. Others pay a lot more if they're deemed high risk and they have to be smuggled in and they can't, for whatever reason, appear through a port of entry. Where do they get this money? These are people who, for those of us who have been down to the border, as I have many times even in the last few months, know that the people who are arriving under these circumstances, having made this long, dangerous journey, they don't have a lot of money. They don't have expendable sums of cash. It's not like they can just go into their local bank and dip into their savings account and come up with $5, $6, $7 grand in US dollars to come up here. No. So how do they pay for it? Well, some of it they were able to scrounge together, perhaps from contributions from friends and family. Maybe they sell everything they've got. Maybe for some that comes close. For a lot of them, it doesn't. So how do they pay it? Well, there's a word for this, and it's a word that's fallen out of use in commonly spoken American English for more than a century and a half. But the word is indentured servitude. It's a word that I certainly had relegated to the history books. That's why I was stunned during my last trip to the border down in the McAllen, Texas area, an area where I lived, and worked among the poorest of the poor as a missionary back in the early 1990s. It's where I learned Spanish, learned to love the culture down there. It's an amazing place with wonderful people. But during my most recent visit, as I was visiting with Border Patrol agents, they told me, for the first time since the Civil War, and certainly since the adoption and ratification of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery and indentured servitude, we have in this country, in the United States of America, in the 21st century, a significant population of indentured servants in the United States. Of these, many are living in what is essentially sex slavery. Others are living in another form of indentured servitude, required to live their lives subject to the will and whim and wishes of these international drug cartels who make money smuggling these people across and then benefit from essentially slave labor from them. One of my colleagues who made an even more recent trip to the border, just came back from the border a week or so ago, recently told me that for those subjected to the form of sex slavery to which these women and girls are subjected, it may take them 6, 7, 8 years to pay off what they owe. They're housed in what can only be described as a rudimentary prison that also doubles as a brothel. And while they are nominally paid in the sense that they're given credit for everything that they do, they're also charged, sometimes exorbitant fees, for room and board, to house, clothe, and feed them. There are detailed records that have to be kept right down to the cost of doing something as simple as removing an ankle bracelet given to them by the Department of Homeland Security to monitor their whereabouts. I'm told that the cost for that is set at $30. But this is one of the reasons why they may have to work 6, 7, 8 years in sex slavery inside this country after they have arrived illegally, unlawfully, in order to pay off their debts to the drug cartels, who are profiting to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year. Most of the men are put to a different type of work, one way or another, moving parcels from one destination to another with their whereabouts closely monitored by the cartels the entire time. But let's get back to the fact that we have a significant population of indentured servants here in the United States once again. Why? What master are we serving by doing this? What good is being advanced by such lawlessness? And at what cost? At what price? Let's think about what this does to neighborhoods, to communities, to schools, to churches. All those people out there who do everything they can to lift up the hands that hang low, to serve their fellow beings, to find those less fortunate themselves and figure out ways to help them. When their soup kitchens and their homeless shelters, even their church pews, even their schools become overrun, they're less able to do what they need to do. And I fear, Madam President, that we as Senate Republicans, having made this commitment to each other and to the American people, and then having abandoned that commitment, as we've done in connection with this, and we will have done should this legislation pass into law without a single shred of border security forcing language in it, we will have done them a grave disservice. We will have done them a grave disservice after promising to help them. That saddens me. I don't understand why we would do that to them. I don't understand why we would do that to ourselves, why we would do that to the American people after having made that commitment as we did. This isn't trivial. It isn't light. These aren't things that are just fun to talk about. In fact, I detest talking about things like human trafficking, about sex slavery. It's not pleasant at all. But we must talk about them, because if we don't talk about them, we cannot fix them. We alone are in charge of funding this government. We alone in this body are equipped to recognize that there are not many ships that pass this direction that are of such import that have so much of a head of steam behind them that they're likely to pass. And this was a uniquely good moment for Republicans to recognize, look, the Democrats have something that they really, really care about. Some Republicans do too, as we've come to find out. But This is an issue that, by and large, unites the Democratic Party and those in the United States Senate who are part of it. They really, really want to send more money to Ukraine. We'll talk about that more in a moment, but it's something that they really, really want to do, even though we've already sent $113 billion there, even though that's more money than any other nation on earth has sent, even though the military aid that we've sent far eclipses not only that of any other nation since this war started, but of every other nation combined. But that's something they really want to do. We also knew that securing our border is something that Republicans care a lot about. I wish it were not only Republicans who cared about our border security, and I'm sure that on some level a number of our Democratic colleagues do too, but just maybe not in the same way that we do. Not enough to call out the president from their party. I know that can be difficult, but maybe that makes some of them uncomfortable. I don't know. It's not for me to say. But the point is this. Most Republicans in Congress feel, or at least profess strongly to feel, a strong need to secure the border, and most Democrats feel very passionately about securing Ukraine's border. Some overlap between those two, I get it. It's an overgeneralization, perhaps. But it's a point that Republicans in the Senate saw, and we realized, gosh, maybe, just maybe, we can cobble together and harness this desire to send more funding to Ukraine on the left with the corresponding desire among Republicans to secure our border. So it was on that basis that we made that commitment about 3 months ago. Sadly, after we made that commitment, we were told that a few Senate colleagues were trying to iron out a compromise. Now, I know and like each of those colleagues. I have great affection for each of them. I've worked with each of them on different pieces of legislation, and I consider each of them friends. I don't know how it went in the Democratic caucus, but I can tell you from my vantage point in the Republican conference, we were kept completely in the dark on the contents of that legislation until a week ago Sunday at 7 p.m. It wasn't until a week ago Sunday at 7 p.m. that we first got to set our eyes on that document that they had spent 3 or 4 months negotiating. Now, it had a lot of provisions in it, a lot of language in it, but the border security portions of that bill didn't do what we committed to do. I don't mean to suggest bad faith on the part of any individual negotiator, but it didn't do what most of us understood the deal to be. What we asked for was not a Ukraine supplemental aid package with an immigration overhaul attached to it, or even an immigration overhaul package containing some provisions of immigration law that might, in the future, under a different administration, prove to be potentially helpful in securing the border. Kind of what this was, certainly how I perceived it. But it wasn't something that would actually force this administration to secure the border and provide consequences if it didn't. To up the ante, to make it more difficult for this administration to continue this pattern of enriching the international drug cartels to the tune of tens of billions of dollars every single year through aggressive non-enforcement of the border. It did not do that. So, look, this was the predictable, foreseeable, and by some of us foreseen and warned of consequence of having a negotiation in which one person was asked to negotiate on behalf of 49 people and also asked not to keep those 49 people apprised of the precise contents of that draft legislation. For many of us, this was unthinkable. I don't know how you can possibly negotiate on behalf of anyone, much less a group of 49, without regularly informing them of exactly what's going on and even providing text that you've been drafting. But alas, that was not my decision, and I have reason to believe it was not even the decision of our lead negotiator, for whom I have great respect and admiration. It was the decision of the Senate Republican leader. It was the decision of the Senate Republican leader, apparently, to keep us in the dark, and also to insist on provisions like those that could have withheld funds from Ukraine, or at least delayed the release of some of the Ukraine aid until such time as certain objectively verifiable border security metrics, benchmarks, indicia of operational control of the border had been achieved for a specified period of time. At one point or another, I think I heard half or more of the Senate Republican conference specifically asking for that and explaining that that's the type of thing that we would need. Either that or something so direct, so clear, so precise as the border security package passed by the House of Representatives, H.R. 2, or, at least its core provisions. Some combination of provisions like those found in H.R. 2 and something like the border security metrics package that I mentioned, perhaps even with something in there putting teeth behind provisions in existing law prohibiting non-citizens from voting in federal elections. Things like that would have gone a long way, and I think could have brought the overwhelming majority, perhaps, of Senate Republicans, depending on the precise contours of the bill, could have brought them into the fold and on board with the topic. But that's not how it worked. So when we discovered that that's not the legislation that we got, even though that was the legislation we asked for, and that we anticipated, and that we committed to each other and to the public and to our voters and to our colleagues down the hall who felt the same way, upon discovering that that's not what it was, within 24 hours, it appeared that that bill was going to go nowhere. Within 48, maybe it was 72 hours of the release of that text, all but 4 Senate Republicans had voted against that measure. What we should have done, what we could have done, what I still don't understand why we didn't do, is then turn forthwith to putting together a package that would, in fact, accomplish what we set out to do, which is force the issue of border security on the Biden administration as a condition, making the release of additional Ukraine aid subject to the achievement of border security, operational control of the border that would be in place as a condition precedent. This didn't happen. But after that didn't happen, oddly enough, 17 or 18, I think it's back down to 17 now, of my Senate Republican colleagues having made that commitment to each other, to their voters, to our colleagues down the hall, to the American people, to governors, to communities, to school principals, all these people who are relying on and affected by our decisions, especially in communities that are being overrun by people not of our land, people entering not according to our laws, in fact, contrary to our laws. We let all of them down. 17 Republicans then decided, well, do you know what? Notwithstanding that commitment, heck with it. Let's just go ahead and pass all the foreign aid stuff. Let's pass all the foreign aid without any border security. Let's help Ukraine with its border security problems, but let's leave ours out there. This may well be the last real opportunity we'd have to do that in this administration. How many more illegal aliens will be brought in? How many more people will come in who are on the terrorist watch list? How many other people will come in from countries that themselves raise suspicion, given the concentration of people who hate our country in those nations from which they came? So why did these 17 Republicans just decide to turn their back on the promise that we had made and on the people who were relying on that commitment? I really don't understand. Nor do I understand why, once we got on the bill, as we approached the bill, we were told by a number of those 17, well, don't worry about it. Once we get onto it, we can have an amendment process. We can at least process amendments. We can have votes on amendments. It'll be fair and open as an amendment process. Don't worry about it. Then we got onto it. And what we were told is that, no, sorry, turns out we don't really need your votes anymore because 17 Republicans agreed so eagerly, so willingly to go along with us even without any of those commitments. We don't really owe anything to you. So I came to the Senate floor, was here most of the day on Saturday, stood here for 4 straight hours, talking about different amendments that I wanted proposed, calling up amendment after amendment. Most of my amendments were germane to the bill, asking that they be made pending. They received objections each day, not from Republicans, but from Democrats on the floor. Those Democrats who voiced objections voiced them again and again and again, saying, in essence, you as Republicans had your chance. You blew your chance. You had your chance at a border security reform package in this bill, and because you didn't take it, you don't get any input into this bill. There was nobody else here at the time who was offering up amendments, asking that they may be made pending, so it wasn't a question of the Senate being just flooded with people wanting their amendments to be pending at the time. This wasn't one where we had bipartisan objections to it. No, these were just Democrats, not Republicans, doing it. What was even more shocking is that after that happened, after amendment after amendment, germane amendment after germane amendment, was rejected from consideration, was not allowed to be made pending. See, when we make something pending, we just sort of put it in a queue of sorts. It says this is something that we're going to dispose of. It's something we're going to address. Maybe we'll dispose of it by a roll call vote, maybe a voice vote. Maybe it'll be disposed of by a point of order, motion to commit, or a motion to table. Maybe if it's a non-germane amendment and we haven't disposed of it by the time cloture is invoked, by the time we decide to bring debate to a close on the bill, then it will fall out and just won't be covered. But no, this was just too much to ask. But what was really shocking and really disappointing was the fact that even after that happened, a number of Republicans, even some of the same Republicans who had said, yeah, we'll stand with you, not another dime to Ukraine until we get the border secure, and then had said, yeah, we'll stand with you now that the border security deal that we received for the first time a week ago Sunday at 7 p.m., and that all but 4 Republicans voted against. Now that that failed, don't worry, we'll have an open amendment process. And then those same Republicans, a number of them, blamed the failure for us to process even a single amendment on this, not on Democrats who had made those objections, but on Republicans. but on the same Republicans, on people like and including me. I hadn't objected to a single other amendment being processed, not one, and yet I was told that I was part of the problem. I don't get it. Sometimes I wonder why somebody would run as a Republican only to take one of the issues that really should be bipartisan, used to be bipartisan, has now become partisan, but apparently now a lot of Republicans don't care about that much because, by golly, they're going to make sure that Ukraine gets funded and they don't want any conditions attached to it. And then they're going to dismiss, denigrate any Republican who expresses concerns with the bill. Not all of those concerns, in fact, most of them related on the amendments that I tried to make pending the other day. A lot of them dealt specifically with things that don't have to do with the border. I had others that did, and I talked about those. Those were rejected that day, but so too did my amendments that deal specifically with the Ukraine portion of the bill. For example, I raised some concerns about aid that might inevitably will flow to Gaza and end up helping Hamas, possibly to the tune of $9 billion or so on the high end. We know what happened when billions of dollars of humanitarian aid over the years flowed into Gaza. Under no circumstance did we say, oh, here's a check from the United States of America to Hamas. No, they were funneled through different aid programs, a lot of them through multilateral, multinational institutions like the United Nations. The thing is, you send money to that part of the country. Gaza is unlike anything that we've ever experienced, those of us who have grown up in the United States and lived our entire lives here. To describe Gaza as a failed state is an insult to failed states everywhere because it's not even a state. Nonetheless, Hamas rules Gaza with an iron fist. And if you send money to Gaza, it is literally impossible to keep that money, keep those benefits out of the hands of Hamas, and to prevent it from benefiting Hamas. It's one of the reasons why October 7th was made possible, this elaborate network of tunnels, all sorts of things, all sorts of benefits, under the banner of international humanitarian aid that went to Gaza, helped Hamas. It strengthened Hamas. And yes, it led to October 7th. Now, lest you think that that was the end of it, October 7th is just a prelude to other things to come, because by the time Hamas and other Iranian proxies in the region have their say, what happened on October 7th in Israel will look like a Sunday picnic. So I raised concerns about that in one of my amendments. In another one of my amendments, I raised concerns about the fact that of the roughly $8 billion or so going to Ukraine under an economic security package, there's no restriction in there preventing that money from going to pay the salaries of Ukrainian bureaucrats. No restriction in there preventing it from funding Ukrainian social welfare programs. No restrictions in there preventing it from going, as similar funds from the United States have gone over the last couple of years in the past, into programs that result in the purchase with U.S. funds of things like concert tickets for Ukrainian concert goers, things to shore up clothing stores in Ukraine. Look, these are things that that we're funding over and over again, specifically as a result of this largesse that we're pouring into Ukraine. And we're doing all of this at a time when the American people are suffering under the oppressive yoke of Bidenomics, where it's costs the average American household an additional $1,000 every single month just to live, just to put gas in the car, groceries in the fridge and the pantry, to afford everything from housing to health care, gas to groceries, and everything in between. You see, when you print multiple trillions of dollars a year, every year, for several years in a row, more than we bring in, inevitably it starts to have the same effect of just printing off more money, which is essentially what we're doing. And what that means is that every dollar you have in your pocket, every dollar that you receive in every paycheck, every dollar that you might have in your bank account, it buys less, significantly less than it did just a few years ago. Now, for the rich, this isn't as much of a burden, both because they have more and because when you're rich, if you're enterprising, you can actually find a way to get richer, a lot richer, in fact, during periods of inflation like this one. This one just hurts everyone else. So look, it's great to be rich at a time like this, and figures from Wall Street will tell you that. President Biden cavalierly says whenever people bring up economic troubles, he and those in his administration love to say, oh, no, how can you say anything's wrong with the economy when Wall Street's doing great? That's of cold comfort. It shows a tone deafness that I'm not sure what to do with. This hurts them a lot when they see their neighborhoods overrun, their schools struggling to keep up with the influx in many communities of new populations of people who don't belong in this country, who have entered this country unlawfully at the invitation and with the blessing of the Biden administration. The American people know something is wrong, deeply wrong, even if they're not privy to exactly the same details that we've been discussing here. They know something's wrong, and it's a profound insult to them that those of us in this chamber would look so cavalierly at their plight, especially after some of us, nearly half of this body, made a commitment that we've now completely flouted, ignored, neglected. So, back to Saturday. It was Senate Democrats who objected every time I raised one of these amendments to even considering any kind of an amendment. My Democratic colleagues said that, quote, MAGA extremists had their chance, close quote, implying that when Senate Republicans rejected the border bill, we somehow forfeited our right to offer amendments. When did that become the principle of this body? When did we accept that if you disagree with the legislation before the Senate, that if you don't plan, intend, or irrevocably commit to supporting that legislation in the end, that you forfeited your right to offer amendments, to offer improvements, to make changes to the bill, to make one provision better or another provision less bad, so that we first do no harm, as is our obligation? When did we become slaves to that principle in this body? When did that become our governing principle? When did we accept that if you disagree with the legislation before the Senate, you can't try to fix it? Where is that written in the Senate rules? When did that become a custom here, or even acceptable here? Now, I would hope my Republican colleagues would unite to completely, emphatically disavow this view, which, to the extent accepted, will continue to trample on the rights of the minority party and disenfranchise the voters we represent. But I'm afraid that some of my Republican colleagues are now entertaining this view and, in fact, fanning its flames, becoming some of its chief advocates. One of my Republican colleagues, the senior senator from North Carolina, reportedly said yesterday afternoon, quote, "You don't put forth 80 amendments and say that you won't negotiate on time agreements and be taken seriously. That's what's happening here. These folks are going to vote against it no matter what," close quote, as if that were the end of the matter. Madam President, do you understand what's implied with that statement? It suggests that if someone is going to vote against a bill, this body should not even consider your amendments. Now, I would hope that this particular colleague was one who I would assume maybe didn't mean that, or that he was quoted out of context. Maybe he didn't think it all the way through. The only problem is I've heard him say it several times now, in private and in public, and he stands by it. I don't get it. This isn't acceptable. This is a rejection of the Senate's best traditions and its longstanding protection of the rights of the minority, whether they be part of the minority party or whether they be people who disagree with whatever is popular at the moment. This view must be rejected so that the Senate can once again embrace an open amendment process where the American public can see our deliberations in public. Instead, Majority Leader Schumer is obstructing a fair and open amendment process by filling the amendment tree and preventing any senator from making amendments pending on the floor. This procedural tactic prevents senators from offering their amendments and allows Senate leadership to screen every single amendment before it's offered from the floor and to dole out penuriously, sometimes punitively, those privileged few opportunities for amendment consideration. It allows senators to avoid any tough votes, to avoid surprises, and in short, to avoid any real debate. Now, when I became a senator in 2011, this was not the standard practice. Sure, there were sharp disagreements between the parties, as there are now, but members could, by and large, come down to the floor, call up an amendment, and make it pending. This change that we've seen was pioneered by Democratic leadership about a decade ago, and then gleefully adopted by Republican leadership as well. In some ways, it got more pronounced, even worse, over the next few years after Republicans gained the majority, and it's gotten steadily worse still since then. It's been the practice that leadership on both sides of the aisle have used for too long to stifle debate, and it must end. I offered a motion to table the amendment tree yesterday, or I guess that's the day before yesterday now. Given that it's now Tuesday morning, so that my colleagues could make their own motions, their own amendments pending. But every Democrat, and unfortunately even some of my Republican colleagues, voted against this. This vote shows that Democrats are not serious about the fair and open or the fair and reasonable amendment process that we were promised before getting on this particular bill. So, I had hoped and I had asked that Republicans unite and demand a better process from our Democratic colleagues. I had urged that we demand an open and honest amendment process on the Senate floor so that the American people could see where we stand. Now, my good friend, the senator from Ohio, has dug very deeply into this disastrous bill and sounded the alarm. This legislation contains provisions requiring the next president to keep funding a proxy war in Ukraine, even if the circumstances have changed, and even if the American people elect a president, specifically because he promises to find a peaceful end to this conflict. it's clear that the GOP is being suckered into lining up yet another ridiculous, baseless political impeachment attempt against the next Republican president, should he become the next Republican president, which many of us hope that he will, including me. How can any Republican or any conservative or anyone who values the rule of law support this? Well, earlier in the day, on Monday, we saw how supporters of this terrible bill have resorted to calling their own constituents uninformed idiots. One member of this body said, quote, "Our base cannot possibly know what's at stake compared to well-informed U.S. senators." Really? Rank-and-file American voters couldn't possibly be as smart, as well-informed, as capable of processing these concepts as a U.S. senator? They couldn't possibly be as well-informed as any of us? Well, forgive me, but I haven't seen much reason for a Mensa club on Capitol Hill in the last few years. And as our own majority leader is attacking the, quote, dimmest and our own minority leader, in fact, is attacking the, quote, dimmest and short-sighted views of people who don't want to throw $60 billion more to prolong the Ukraine conflict. These are not the words of people who wish to be elected lawmakers much longer, let alone one day take the majority of the U.S. Senate. Madam President, I, like many of my colleagues, made a commitment, and I think it's important that we as Republican senators acknowledge that we made that commitment and not just pretend it didn't exist, as 17 of my colleagues seem hell-bent on doing. That's why I didn't support cloture. That's why I will not vote to send aid to Ukraine without securing our southern border. On Sunday, I came down to the floor again to ask again that a fair and open amendment process be held. So I made a motion to table the motion to recommit. I did so, you see, because I care about the rights and the perspectives of my colleagues in this chamber. I believe that filling the amendment tree and being forced to cave to the demands of the leadership of the opposite party was something that was being forced on us quite unfairly, quite wrongly. When I ran for office, I understood that I may have to take tough votes from time to time. As we're often told, if you don't want to fight fires, don't sign up to be a firefighter. And if you don't want to take tough votes, don't run for any legislative office. This is just part of the job. So I ask that each member of this body be able to offer amendments and to debate those amendments as he or she chose. My colleagues decided to decline that proposition, voting against it. The Senate cast its final cloture vote to end debate a few hours ago. Republicans, as we approached that time, continued to ask for more amendments, but continued to be blocked. To my colleagues, I'd remind them, we didn't have to vote for cloture. Not a single Republican had to vote for cloture last night. The bill as drafted doesn't have to pass even today. Even though cloture has been achieved, it still doesn't have to. But last night, as of last night, Republicans couldn't resist the temptation, 17 of them, to help. Democrats couldn't have passed it on their own. 17 Republicans chose to help them. If we were to stand together and we were to have voted against cloture on the underlying bill, we could have prolonged the debate, enabling the opportunity for us to pass germane amendments, of which there were many, of which I had introduced many, that could remove or fix many of the flaws that I've previously outlined. So while deeply concerning all of this is, as deeply concerning as all of this is, I do maintain some hope in the fact that Speaker of the House Mike Johnson has been clear. The bill as drafted is dead on arrival in the House. So I ask the question in closing, why would we vote to send a bill? Why would Senate Republicans, 17 of them, play any role in sending a bill to a majority Republican House, one that is destined to fail in the House? Doing so is counterproductive and doesn't advance the interests of the Republican majority in the House. I hope that as we move forward, we'll do things differently, and I hope that on this vote, I'd ask once again for Republicans to stand together and oppose this bill, even if they voted for previous cloture motions. They don't have to vote yes on final passage. In any event, this debate shouldn't conclude. We should remember that we should not pass legislation that fails to secure our border and ignore the interests of the American people, even while shoring up the borders of Ukraine. As their elected lawmakers, as though those who have been sent by states to represent their interests in the United States Senate, I know we can do better. A no vote is a vote to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, those subjected to indentured servitude, to sex slavery, those whose communities, whose soup kitchens, whose homeless shelters, whose church pews, classrooms are being overrun. We stand with them. By voting against this bill, I stand for the rule of law and against lawlessness, cartels, and all the horrors that go along with them. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.